those, right? Cool. What's up? All right, I'm going to try that one more time. Share. That looks like the right one, I hope. Yes, okay. Victorian Woodtype advertising is what we're going to talk about tonight. So to do that, so one of the things that we're going to kind of track over the course of this class in very broad strokes is the evolution, like the major evolutions of typography and how we end up going from centered kind of small book typography to basically the 20th century. And so one of the things that to me is really interesting is this crazy kind of 19th century circus looking stuff, because it's actually like a super critical link. So really quickly, we're going to look at the application of book design to advertising. So everything we looked at in the last lecture was all book design. I think that if you had dug into some of the other stuff I might have included in the package, there was a few things that were more like manifestos or whatever, but those were still texts meant to be read. They weren't advertisements. So this is a proclamation by John C. Trumbull from Connecticut. And so this is interesting. So this is basically a poster, except that it looks like a page out of a book. And it's roughly 12 inches by 6 inches. So not too big, and really it's meant for you to read. Here's another proclamation. So this is 9 3/4 by 5. So again, like it's a flyer and it's totally the size of a book page and it's typeset like a book page. And considering the fact that you wouldn't have really access to too many other mass communications methods, getting a weird page from the president is probably like a good way to do it. You probably want him to fully explain what it is he's talking about. But you can imagine that if someone handed you this now, you'd be like, I am not reading that. Like, what are you smoking? This is another one, an election notice. In this one, we see some efforts to break up the text and to pull out some hierarchy. So we've got like nomination. And then what's kind of interesting is that it pulls out things that are important in the order that they're important, but it's pretty clear they're saying nomination, Aaron Burr. Like those are the sort of two most important things happening. I'm gonna try to zoom out a little bit so that we can see the bottom of that. So, so there starts to be a play with hierarchy of like, okay, it's still written like prose, but now they're trying to pull some stuff out on the way down. And within that, they're also like Republican citizens, Joseph Annan Esquire, William Tabor, chairman. Like apparently this is a very important piece of information, right? But it still basically looks like a book. It just looks like kind of a hyperactive book. And again, it's small, fits on a letter-sized sheet. Here's a port order. So in this one, they're really going to town to try to get you to see. So this is 1799. They're trying to get you to see like this is important. So like Thomas Leyland, mayor. It's like nice and big. And then we go into this, and there's this awesome thing of calling out important details throughout here. So it's like the mayor and magistrates, unfortunate accidents, carelessness, inattention, load, fire, guns, board, merchant ships, river, think at their duty. Like it's insane, but like you get what it is they're trying to do. It's not like they didn't just sit there and start randomly making stuff all capitals because like they thought it would look cool. It was like we need it to be clear that there's important stuff happening here. But the grand scheme of things is like you probably want to start breaking up this information into a different pattern, but those patterns basically don't exist yet. Yeah.
The whole thing is one sentence also.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, one amazing sentence.
Commas.
And even the way they sign these things, like it's essentially signed like it's a letter, which is pretty cool or interesting. I also like the all caps into like small caps right here. There's a lot of nice detail in this. It's actually like pretty like visually attractive, even if the capitalization stuff is a kind of crazy way of handling the situation.
It reminds me of like the town crier.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, just like taking the place like that.
And then we have another one. So these are really small. Like this is 5 by 6, the size of a postcard. Again, trying to pull out hierarchy. And so I think the thing that you realize is that the visual form of this, you're like they're running into the wall of what can be done if you continue to write in prose and you continue to make it look like a book. And they're basically taking little tiny sheets of paper and yelling with them. This one is fantastic. Like this is, every single line is changing just about until you get down to here, and then it's one paragraph. But then I love that the like printer, I can't remember what this symbol is called, but like the little printer's hand that's like telling you, oh, this is really important. Like if you're still interested, by the time we get down here, there's some other stuff to pay attention to. And again, it's small, 7 by 5. This is 1812. But they're doing interesting stuff, right? Like they pulled out this crazy typeface to try to get your attention. It's definitely charming if it's not at all, like there's no sense of harmony, right? This is pretty interesting too. So it's like a timber sale. So to get the type to be as big as possible, they got rid of the space between the words and basically put little bits of micro spacing between them. Because you can tell there is some space there, but those are not normal spaces between sentences. And then you get down here and they can't, either they don't have another font. So if you transport yourself to 1815, you have metal type, right? You have drawers of metal type. If all your jobs in your print shop have used up whatever 36 point, I don't know what this is, Caslon, and all you have is like 24 point or something like, or 30, like how do you make something bigger? So they start jamming space between things to make this more impactful. And then like bigger than normal spaces between this to try to make this more impactful so that they can get that hierarchy. Oak timber, to be sold, 40 large oak trees. So there's like this hierarchy thing happening. And they're breaking this stuff up into, it's still a sentence, right? To be sold at the Globe in Nether Stowey on Wednesday the 19th, day of April, instant, by 4 o'clock, 40 large oak trees. Lot number 1 to 10, both inclusive. The trees are, you know, like the whole thing is basically a sentence or two. But they're breaking them up into chunks of information. And then this one is a little bit bigger, but still not very big. 9.5 by 6.5, basically, a Mailcoach Notice. So this is kind of cool though. It still looks like a book page, but the hierarchy is a little bit clearer. They're like using some visuals to try to get your attention, like look, a picture of a mail coach, and then calling out really largely like Boston, because that's like the key city there, and Plymouth and Sandwich, mail stage. And then it goes back into your sort of normal kind of like fully justified paragraphs of basically book typography. Okay, so we're going to go into the invention and effect of wood type. So one thing I'm going to point out here, why is this stuff so small? It's a technological limitation based on metal type. So if anyone has ever been in a letterpress shop, metal type is soft. It's not hard. It's not like it's steel or something. A lot of times when you see letterpress with like kind of beat up impressions, it's because metal type gets beat up with use. You see this especially if you like look through old books that used like, you know, if you find a mass market paperback that was letterpress printed, and you'll see like letters that barely make an impression because they're so beat up and so used. So if you think about your InDesign or Illustrator and the typeface selection, or not the typeface, the type size selection you have, you know, why is it 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 18, 24, blah, 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 and why does it only go up to 72? because those are the sizes of metal type. Metal type only went up to 72 points. Anything bigger than that would get destroyed. And you certainly couldn't make a big, giant 4-inch tall letter. It would be expensive and it wouldn't work. So some enterprising person realizes that we need bigger typefaces to cut through the noise. Like, you need them for advertising. You need to make bigger things to cut through, right? Like, if everyone's handing out postcards and you're the person with a poster, lucky you, right? Like, all of a sudden you've just like visually decimated the competition. But then to fill up that poster, you cannot fill it with even 72-point type. It would look like a book again. So if you want to make posters, you now need bigger type. So someone starts making wood type.
And that's like, it's carved, like each letter is carved
Yeah.
by hand.
Yeah. So first thing to notice here, 15 inches by 12 inches. If I didn't tell you that, this looks exactly the same as everything else, right? It's roughly typeset the same, but it is huge. It's twice as big as everything else. This is like what wood type affords. All of a sudden, like, you get this bigger thing. The other thing is the typefaces. This is like poster Bodoni, so it's kind of like Bodoni on crack. You can start to have typefaces that don't need to be readable at book sizes, which prior to this, your typefaces had to be readable in a book. Didn't, like, what other application would there be for it? But all of a sudden you can have typefaces that really only work when they're huge. So you can start to have display faces. And again, like, the higher, like, they're still doing roughly the same thing, but they're definitely like, I need this headline to be giant and bold. Why did I include this? I screwed up here. This one is not right. It should not be in here. Except for I'm convinced maybe that this stuff at the top here, I'm convinced that these are actually potentially wood type. But we're gonna skip that because I don't like to be proved wrong. So here's another one, 15 by 12. So again, 2 to 3 times bigger than the things that we've been seeing. These giant letters now. Not giant by our standards, but giant by the standards of the stuff that we've been looking at. Like, if this thing is 15 inches tall, this right here is potentially 2 inches tall. And now we start to have like lots of like kind of these fun, thick typefaces. This is also probably like the grimmest thing I've ever scanned. So, but the other thing is crazy is like one thing that we're seeing here is the sentence stuff is starting to fall away. Now it's like a list. It's actually organized by hierarchy of like, these are your A-list slaves and these are your B-listers. Not quite as good, apparently. And then also for sale, fine rice, gram, patty, books, cloth. So it's kind of bizarre. I'm so glad that somebody saved this though, because it's obviously super beat up. It's from a really old book too. It's an interesting find. So here's another one, 7 by 8. So not huge, but still bigger than we've been seeing. And then we see more of these funky typefaces that didn't exist before. So this looks a lot like something like Rockwell that still gets used today. Kind of poster Bodoni, another version of that. Bigger, kind of crazier typefaces. And then, and even when they are making a statement inside, it's starting to be like really amped up. Like the contrast is really high. This one is fantastic. So I have like multiple giant typefaces, extensive stock Parisian wares, boom. And then it's crazy because this is actually a list of everything they sell. And it's like the whole thing is a sentence, which is pretty great. Like, this stock consists of an extensive and general assortment of jewelry of the most modern patterns and superior quality, silver and British plate. And of course, like, we wouldn't read this like the equivalent of this now, but I would imagine that in 1830, this new sort of like exuberant looking stuff that you might be like, you might actually take the time to read everything that comes into your life. Yeah, but again, like fantastic, like these cool kind of shadowed typefaces, multiple types of these different Bodonis, this thick kind of extra bold Clarendon sort of thing. This one is small, but again, like we're seeing these bigger, thicker typefaces. We're almost like not seeing stuff that's text size anymore. Unfortunately, this is not really red. It's in an old book from the 70s, and it was cheaper to print. Like everything was either black and white or black and red in the book, so it kind of fools you. But this one's pretty big, 11 by 8.5. And again, we get like this, like a shadowed poster Bodoni. We got that kind of Rockwell thing up here. You see how they're playing with spacing, like to make it more impactful. Whereas like the earlier stuff, the classical typography, the spacing is to get the type to kind of do this beautiful mellowing out. Here, it's like, if they're putting spacing in there, it is to try to make this, like, they can't use a bigger typeface, so what's the alternative? Stretch out that typeface in some way. Because then we see this like nice and thick and black. It's this 9 by 11.75. So again, it's like close to double the size of some of the stuff we've been seeing. And at first you wouldn't think anything of it, but like we get all of these awesome, super black typefaces now. And this is kind of nice. They ran out of numbers, I'm assuming, down here. So it's like all the Rockwell or whatever it was, like they used it all up and now they have to switch to like a nice thick Bodoni. Luckily they still have that one. This is pretty great. So a playbill. So it's interesting, right? Like every inch of the surface is used. There's no such thing as white space. Nobody has yet to have the idea of like, what if the way our stuff stood out was that we left most of the page blank, right? Instead, it's like everyone is screaming and trying to figure out like what stuff doesn't need to be screamed but needs to be there versus like what stuff are we yelling? Like barrack room, handsome husband, he would be an actor, Olympic Devils. Each one a different typeface too. And then there's the other thing I haven't really been talking about is the massive contrast between lines that they're shooting for. So like black. Now, granted, this is all black, but what I mean is like dark to kind of gray, dark to gray, dark to gray, big to tiny, big to tiny. So like contrast is super important, which is like a way of dealing with hierarchy. Like how do we make this other stuff look important? We make the text look smaller or less important. But even still, like if we have this thing in person, we'd see all kinds of detail in here. And this is also one thing I love about this piece, which is that the major bits are all justified against the outer edge, kind of starting to play with the idea of having a structure. Now, granted, I understand that the outer edge is also the limits of where they can put type, but still a nice idea. And this is pretty great, an election notice. So this is huge, 36 by 23. Like, so now we have a giant poster. And again, and it's like informational, right? Now, granted, I understand it's a list of names. It is information, but it's not hard to imagine that in 1790, the same list of names would be followed with all kinds of texts about where they're from and all kinds of other things. And maybe it would say like the Honorable Gentleman, Richard M. Johnson. Instead, we just have for President, Martin Van Buren, for Vice President, Richard M. Johnson. This is like, I think this one's really interesting. I don't understand. Like that this is title case and this is title case and then everything else is uppercase. And I can't tell if it's because like in the scheme of things, the president is the most important of like this thing and the governor is more important than the lieutenant governor. And that was like their, like I can't tell, you know, thinking about the thinking made visual idea, is there a conceptual thing happening here? Or is it just like, yeah, that's what I got for, if I want to make the poster Bodoni fit, it's got to be title case because if it's all uppercase, it doesn't fit. Regardless, it looks awesome, or so I say. And these nice little things of like breaking this stuff apart but still packing it in. I like that this guy is centered because, you know, like if we made the same list, we would just accept that one of these columns would be one name longer than the rest. And that would be fine. Instead, this guy has to be jammed in the center. There's another, oh, this is actually a theater, no, an election bill that's supposed to look like a theater bill because I believe it's making fun of the competition. And again, like just massive contrast, like these big headlines coming through. They're not even headlines, right? They're just like names and then little bits of other information. I believe that this is another one that is one sentence. So this is 13 by 9, so not massive, but still quite a bit bigger than the other stuff we were looking at. You see the kind of nice texture in here from the wood type. It doesn't leave like a totally even impersonation all the time. The other thing that's great is like wood type introduces typefaces that we still see today. That'll surprise you. Like we haven't seen the heavy metal font yet, but like when you see this like super spiky font, you're like, oh man, that looks like a 70s metal band. And you see a lot of things that look like very 70s-ish because a lot of designers rebelled against what was happening with very kind of austere Swiss Helvetica looking stuff. And then what they looked at instead was the last kind of moment of pre-modern exuberance. Yeah, fantastic. Boom, caution, selling beer. And look how narrow this is. So this is like another way of dealing with the limitations, right? Like if you can make it really narrow, then you can make a typeface that's taller and that lets you like use that space differently. And it's also visually interesting. I just love this bit up here. The rest of it is kind of boring, but I guess they're telling you this is how much money you'll get if you catch these guys. Oh no, that's how much money they stole, I believe. This is still pretty big though, 13 by 9. Oh, that's everything. So that is Victorian wood type typography. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to add here. So what I think is interesting about this stuff is that it looks like, at first it just looks crazy, right? Like it's crazy and the type is big and it looks like circus type or whatever, but that if you start to look at what happened right beforehand and you think about the context, like the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of things like middle class and of public space, this is like the answer to those developments, but it's also firmly within the path of classical typography. So we don't have like the fundamental break yet that really we don't have until avant-gardes of the early 20th century. They're the ones that then take this basically and start to break it into pieces that are allowed to be anywhere on the page. And that ends up being a very like that'll be the next thing we look at, which is when you start to see early 20th century designers and you realize they're using the exact same fonts as the Victorian circus posters, basically. But they're doing this thing that's more inspired by Mondrian than anything else. So that. Stop this. Bye-bye, internet.